Hello everyone and welcome to today's Farm Advisory Service webinar. My name is Ben Law, I'm part of the Specialist Forestry team from SAC Consulting. In today's webinar, Buying into Forestry, we'll be exploring how farmers and landowners can make new commercial woodland work for them so they can reap the benefits of forestry and maintain control of the land. We're joined tonight by Simon Hart, Director and Head of Scotland Forestry team at Clegg & Co, who'll be speaking to us about the commercial values of the forestry market and investment values. We're also joined by Matt Thompson, Director of Munro Harvesting, who will be giving us a valuable update on the current timber market and what timber returns can deliver for your farms and how landowners can maximise the values of their forestry investments. We're joined also by George Hepburne Scott, Business Development Director of Forest Carbon Limited, who will be speaking to us about the value that carbon credits can add to forestry in the UK and recent changes in this growing market. And finally, we're joined by Malcolm Young, Senior Forestry Consultant at SAC Consulting, to present a case study of a Scottish farm business which has successfully established a commercial forestry scheme and to give some of the key facts and figures in this project. So we've still got a few attendees joining us just now and in the waiting room, but what we'll do is we'll make a start with these slides. So starting with Simon, we'll just see if we can get his presentation up and running. Simon, over to you.
Thank you, Ben, and good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name's Simon Hart. I work for Clegg & Co in the Edinburgh office. We're part of Strutton Parker and the BNP group. Tonight, just briefly, I'm going to talk to you about the forestry market, and I'm going to look at some of your investment considerations, particularly being clear on your objectives and a plea to go for quality. Ben, if we could have the next slide, please. And again. So this data comes from our analysis of the forestry market in 2020. And what you see is a record-breaking year. The size of the market was some £200 million, made up of 61 properties. These are all commercial properties, over 12,500 hectares, with an average property size of over 200 hectares. The point I'm making here is that there's a lot of demand for woodlands at the moment. There's a strong market, rising demand and rising prices. And you can see over the last 10 or 15 years, the size of the market has been growing fairly steadily upwards. So that's the overview. Looking at some of the more specific detail, if you could move to the next one, Ben. This is plotting mean prices for woodlands against timber prices. So if you look at the green bars, this is average price of woodlands in pounds per hectare. I'm not quite sure if you can all see it, but over the last 20 years, if you go back to the beginning of that period in the early noughties, forestry plantation values were relatively low and weren't really going anywhere. They were sort of ticking along at about £2,000 to £4,000 per hectare. Then we saw prices jump up over the next 10 years, a fairly steady doubling of values. And then over the last 5 years, we've seen quite a pronounced rise in values. And that really is quite significant as well. In 2019, average prices were £11,500 per hectare. But in 2020, average prices were £16,000 per hectare. So quite a significant increase in values. And there are a number of reasons why there might be an increase in demand. One of them is timber price and low interest rates. But I think the key one is timber price. And if you look at the red line, that's timber price, the left-hand scale from the Forestry Commission Index. And you see a very good correlation with timber price and the value of plantations. So in the early part of the period, timber prices were fairly flat or even declining. Then they doubled over the next 10 years, and then they've gone up by another 50% over the last 5 years. So the point I would like to make here is that the plantation values are underpinned by the sort of logic of timber price. So there's an investment logic behind this whole thing. The fundamentals are good. And if we look to the future, we're only ever going to get to net zero if we start building more things out of wood and less things out of concrete and steel. So demand for timber is clearly going to increase. And I think that means that prices inevitably will increase. We move to the next slide, Ben. So in the previous slide, we looked at commercial woodlands, and I just want to briefly touch on amenity woodlands here. Forget about most of the data, but have a look at the £1,500 as an average value of a mixed woodland. So it's more like an amenity woodland in Scotland. Amenity woodlands tend to be sold in small scale, and people talk about them in acres rather than hectares. My point I'm making here is that commercial woodlands have got a significant value. Amenity woodlands have a much lower value. Now, there might be lots of good reasons for planting an amenity woodland, and it might be perfectly logical, but you do need to be aware that your investment value in the long term of the actual woodland will be lower. We can move to the next slide, please, Ben. As an investor, I think you need to be very clear on your objectives. This is absolutely crucial. What is your long-term strategy? Have you got an exit strategy? For example, are you planting a woodland now that you might want to sell in 10 years' time, or might it be part of a long-term land holding? Is timber returns part of your objectives? If it is, then it determines what kind of species you might plant. Is the woodland you're creating a standalone woodland, or is it something that you might want to sell off separately? If it's something you might want to sell off separately, then you need to be thinking carefully about access, for example. If you're developing a holiday business, perhaps you want to plant an amenity woodland. You might be looking at planting woodland for shelter rather than timber. And the answers to these questions will significantly affect what you do, where you do it, and how you do it. It's quite complicated, and I can't stress enough, speak to a forestry professional to make sure that you're aware of all the options. Now we move on to the last slide, Ben. If you've decided to go down the investment route, this is a plea to invest in quality. The reason for investing in quality is that well-established, well-maintained plantations at the end of their rotation in the current market are worth £25,000 to £40,000 per hectare. That's a significant value, and it really is worthwhile doing it properly. Rotation lengths might be 40 years. If you plant fast-growing spruce, you could be looking at as little as 30 years. So we're talking about big sums of money. What this means is that if you waste years in the early part of the rotation, you are diminishing the value of your investment quite significantly. Obviously, it depends on how you do your economics and what your final value is. But my rule of thumb is every wasted year is costing you £200 to £300 per hectare. So, for example, if you don't do a weeding and you lose a year's growth, you've thrown away £300. A heavily weeded property, you can easily lose 2 or 3 years of growth. So you might have thrown away £1,000, and all you've done is save one weeding. If you let the sheep in year 2 and they nip the tops out of all your spruce, you've thrown away another year. And also, you've now got multi-stem trees, so you won't be getting £40,000 a hectare from the sawmiller at the end of the rotation. So what I'm saying here is don't cut corners on establishment and maintenance. Do it properly. So just to recap, the forestry market is good, prices are strong, a good time to be investing in forestry. Be very clear on your objectives, and if you're going for commercial, make sure you invest in quality. And I want to leave you with a final thought. There's a well-known Chinese proverb which says that the best time to plant a tree was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now. So just imagine if your father or grandfather had planted 15 or 20 hectares on your farm in 1980 with some fast-growing spruce. It might have been on a bit of land that wasn't of particularly high agricultural value, maybe a bit steep, maybe a bit wet. That 15 to 20 hectares could now be giving you £500,000 of tax-free income from timber. Makes a real difference to your investment. Now, maybe your father didn't make the decision to plant some trees then, but now you've got the chance to plant them today and invest in your future. Thank you very much.
Fantastic, Simon. We're going to open up now to anyone who wants to ask any questions before we move into the next presentation. So we've had a few submitted for this event, Simon, of which one we'll see if we can bring up just now. In terms of plantations, you mentioned the commercial conifer blocks. Is there any particular species that you recommend planting in particular? And if so, why?
The marketplace is dominated by Sitka spruce. Sitka spruce is what was mainly planted in the uplands in the 1970s and 80s. So that's where the track record lives. And all the investment in terms of tree breeding, etc., tended to be in Sitka spruce. So, and on most sites, the answer is always Sitka spruce. It tends to grow faster than everything else, and the sawmillers and the marketplace wants it. But you have got alternatives, but you need to be careful about what you're planting and be clear on your objectives. And of course, the other thing is, if you put all your eggs in the Sitka basket and something happens to Sitka, then your investment's going to catch a cold. So far, all the diseases seem to be affecting everything but Sitka.
Well, may it last. We've had another question come through here as well, Simon. You've mentioned the tax treatment for timber investments. Is that something you could elaborate on briefly? Yes,
so timber income is tax-free. The flip side of that is you don't get tax relief on your investment. And then, of course, if you're running a commercial forest, it also counts as business property. So like agricultural property relief, you get 100% relief from inheritance tax.
Okay, fantastic. Well, I'm sure there'll be a few interesting thoughts going through some of the attendees' minds just now. Thanks very much, Simon. We'll hop across to our next presentator, Matt Thompson.
Thanks, Ryan. So I am a timber merchant and marketer for a company called Munro Harvesting, and I'm based in North of Scotland. So my role is to buy standing sales or even sometimes roadside sales of timber, forestry. I then manage the job, sell the logs on, and hopefully everybody's happy. Now, let's start with a couple of facts. The UK is within the top 5 of both timber harvesting, timber being imported, and timber use. So we're clearly missing a trick here that we not have enough timber within the UK. Timber prices currently are very, very, very high for a whole host of reasons.
I think we've suffered some technical difficulties there. We appear to have just lost Matt. We'll give him a couple of minutes, see if we can get him to reconnect. And hopefully he'll rejoin us shortly.
Ben, shall we just move on to George just now and then come back to Matt, and I'll try and get him on?
I think we may have to. Unfortunately, This might be a challenge of everyone being on the internet at once.
Yeah.
George, are you ready to go?
Yes. Yeah.
Fantastic.
Great. Thank you all. I'm just going to give a brief introduction on forest carbon. Firstly, we are a leading developer of woodland creation projects for the UK voluntary carbon market. We've helped co-fund over 200 woodland creation projects across the UK, ranging anywhere from 2 hectares up to 350 hectares. 70% of those projects being in Scotland. And the funding comes from carbon credits to UK businesses wishing to mitigate the impacts of their carbon footprints. Carbon sequestration is only one of a wide range of co-benefits that those projects are delivering. All our projects undergo a rigorous quality assurance process under the UK government's Woodland Carbon Code. We've also been active in developing the peatland carbon market in the UK, and we've also had a hand in developing Ireland's first carbon projects, where we worked on behalf of Microsoft. As mentioned, all our projects are funded that are funded by our partners are validated and verified under the Woodland Carbon Code. This was launched by the UK government in 2011, and it offers independent auditing process and ISO certified carbon credits. And these are accepted under UK government guidance on environmental reporting. Projects meet all international carbon project rules, and this covers aspects such as additionality, that the intervention of carbon funding was critical to the project proceeding, quality assurance, conservatism, permanence, and monitoring, that there's a thorough inspection regime to enforce standards throughout the duration of a project. And it's now recognised as one of the leading domestic carbon standards in the world. It's focused solely on the creation of new woodlands in the UK, and that can be a mix of commercial conifer projects through to non-intervention native broadleaf projects. The UK Land Carbon Registry, that some of you may have heard of, this was launched back in the end of 2020. It includes all UK Woodland Carbon Code and Peatland Code projects, and it's essentially a publicly accessible platform that enables anyone to check on the ownership, assignation or retirement of carbon credits. Currently, Forest Carbon are able to raise for project hosts between £1,500 to £3,500 per net planted hectare. This is paid out typically across 2 tranches at year 1 and year 5. And that payment I mentioned, based on a hectare basis, breaks back to somewhere in the order of £8.50 to £9 per tonne. And I suspect you may well have heard, a wide array of figures, but that's based on what we're currently able to raise. This funding is available in addition to any available grants that a project might be able to secure. And essentially, the overall payment is based on the future carbon that project is anticipated to sequester, less some significant buffers to reflect scientific risk and project failure risk. And we utilise the Woodland Carbon Code lookup tables and carbon calculator to come up with those estimations. And clearly, the rate of sequestration is influenced by species mix, yield class, soil type, ground preparation techniques, and also the long-term management of that particular project. Carbon farming can generate a surplus for the landowner. The level of that surplus will depend on, primarily the cost of the project and the volume of carbon that's likely to be sequestered. Pricing is influenced by geography and project profile. In certain parts of the UK, there might be a scarcity of projects, which might drive higher prices. Some businesses may want to invest in projects close to their headquarters, for example, and that might drive a higher price. But buyers will also have a clear interest and focus on kind of wider co-benefits, so projects that can demonstrate biodiversity enhancement, flood risk mitigation, and also timber production can be of interest. And I mentioned timber production. We've had a number of recent conversations with some from the house building construction sector, where they're particularly interested by those projects that are providing timber long term. This is quite a lengthy slide, and I'll try and canter through it, but it's particularly topical at the moment because there is a lot of talk around carbon pricing, and I just wanted to kind of raise some thoughts on this, and I'm sure there'll be opportunity for more questions on this afterwards. But the price that we've been able to raise for projects has increased significantly over the last year in comparison to the previous 14 years that we operated. There's growing commentary emerging around prices exploding for carbon credits over the coming years and decades, as more and more businesses set themselves net zero and carbon neutrality targets. And I think we do certainly anticipate that prices will grow, but neither us nor I don't think anyone else is in a position to accurately forecast where prices are likely to go. I think it's worth just flagging some key fundamentals that may have a bearing on pricing today and into the future. It's still a voluntary market in the UK. No UK businesses are obligated to buy woodland carbon or peatland carbon credits. There is always the option for these businesses to buy international high quality carbon credits or low cost credits, or do nothing. Even if there was compulsion on businesses to take action, it might well be at some point in the future that the price gets so high that businesses actually think it's going to be more financially advantageous for us to implement insetting and carbon reduction measures internally to further reduce reliance on fossil fuels. It might also be the case that other offset mechanisms emerge in the future, which could be nature-based, but could also be tech-based. So whilst woodland creation and peatland restoration are the only markets available at the moment, others may emerge in the future. And we also get some sense from businesses that the price that they are paying for UK credits, they want to see the price they are paying to some degree pegged to the overall cost of the delivery of a project, rather than facilitating what they might perceive as delivering kind of excess returns. It's a word of caution. I'm not saying that's throughout, across the board, but it's just worth mentioning. And finally, buying pending issuance units is a leap of faith. They represent a future promise of carbon to be delivered over a long-term horizon. it can, at least 30 years, can run up to 100 years. So that can bring risks with it. I just wanted to touch on kind of routes to market. I mean, clearly I've mentioned that one option is working with the likes of ourselves, but land managers can look to access markets directly themselves, whether they've got business connections locally or nationally. Typically in this case, they need to take on the costs of validation and verification themselves longer term. They could also look to retain carbon credits to report against their own farm emissions. I think this is becoming increasingly important as organisations look at supply chains and the emissions associated with the production of food. And I'm aware that the Scottish Farm Advisory Service do help farmers and crofters secure grants to help cover the cost of farm audits. And I think that's going to be increasingly important. The third option could be to retain a certain volume or all of your units to sell over the long term as they're converted to verified carbon units. And in this particular case, you may be looking to speculate on a future rise in the price of carbon. That might work for some parties, but for others, it might not work because it wouldn't necessarily derive an income stream in the short term, which might be necessary. I'll very quickly run through this just kind of process of how to go about securing carbon funding via forest carbon. The first step is completing our application form. This has got to come to us well in advance of planting starting. We'll review the project through the eyes of the Woodland Carbon Code. And if we're happy that the project meets the requirements of the code, we will then issue an offer. And if that is acceptable, we'll issue a contract for signing, and we'll then take the project forwards to be registered with the Woodland Carbon Code. Once the project is validated, and that happens after completing the planting, we will then look to sell the credits from that particular project. And we will make the first payment to the landowner. The second payment comes at year 5 following the first verification inspection, which is carried out by an independent certification body. We are open to discussing alternative structures with applicants, and this could include carbon funding that we're raising for landowners being linked directly to the end sales price. In this case, they might realise a higher price, but they'd be sharing in the risk and the time lag of with forest carbon of finding those end buyers or buyer. Just touch on the commitments associated with longer-term contracts. The Woodland Carbon Code states that contracts could be a minimum of 30 years. So as a consequence, our contracts have to adhere to that. Projects must demonstrate that they're additional, with carbon funding being critical in enabling them to proceed. For example, this could be the need to bridge a gap between the cost of the project and available grants, or making up for future income forgone. Whilst every project validated under the Woodland Carbon Code contributes 20% of the gross claimable carbon to risk buffer, there is still an obligation to replant in the event of loss or damage. And we would stress the importance to project hosts of ensuring woodland creation projects where possible. And should there be a change of ownership, we also have a requirement to be informed, as do Scottish Forestry, who manage the code, and our contract has a clause that covers that scenario. This chart briefly just shows the different carbon sequestration rates across different project profiles. The red and blue lines at the bottom reflect a predominantly commercial conifer project, either being clear-felled or thinned and clear-felled. And from year 30 onwards, the carbon sequestration tails off and is capped at somewhere between 200 to 250 tonnes per net hectare. The top purple line represents an example non-intervention broadleaf project, and it shows that by year 50, it's anticipated that broadleaf scenario will have sequestered somewhere in the order of double the carbon from those conifer scenarios. That is based on the Woodland Carbon Code lookup tables, which clearly account for the loss of carbon in the timber being taken off site. There is growing pressure and dialogue around trying to account for some of that embodied carbon downstream, but I think that it does present challenges around how you track that and account for it longer term. I'm just going to touch on 2 case studies where carbon funding has played a role. These are projects that have got a commercial element to them. This was a scheme in Scottish Borders we worked on with SAC back in 2019. In this particular case, it was made up of lots of thin shelter belt strips, and as a consequence, fencing costs were particularly high, and that's where carbon funding played a critical role in co-financing this project. The second one was a project up in Aberdeenshire, a smaller project, but again, mix of Sitka, Norway, with some native broadleaves. Carbon funding played a critical role here due to a cash flow deficit over the first 2 years of the project. So carbon funding was of considerable help in getting that project off the ground. I'm very briefly going to touch on peatland restoration. I've mentioned the peatland code earlier in my presentation. It's a relatively immature market, but it is growing some traction. And this is one case study of a project that we helped co-finance at the back of last year, restoration project in the Scottish Borders, owned by Borders Forest Trust. And they've delivered a restoration project just over 100 hectares of degraded peatlands. But I definitely see that market emerging over the coming years. Final slide, I just wanted to show some of the 500 or so businesses we've worked with since we started in 2006, and to flag it, in many cases it can take years from first engagement with a business to them actually committing to invest in projects, and we spend a lot of time developing these relationships to the point where businesses are comfortable kind of committing, and then there's ongoing advice and guidance that we then give to businesses around how they communicate their investment in particular projects. But we're in growing interest from businesses in this sector, and eager to identify more projects moving forwards. Many thanks.
Thanks, George. Very informative. We'll open back up to questions on the floor again. We've already had a few questions come through. George, we've got a question here regarding woodland carbon sales. Are these treated tax-free the same way as timber sales are?
Yes, we believe they are. I mean, we've now delivered 200, over 200 projects, and that has been the guidance that we've received and others have received, who have made inquiries with their tax advisors and accountants. I think we would always stress that applicants, landowners make their own inquiries in this regard, but our understanding and the widespread understanding is that it is treated in the same manner as timber income.
Perfect. We've also had a question here from a landowner. They're considering planting woodlands, but they're contemplating between conifer and native broadleaves. Clearly, they've got different values. Can you give any guidance on these from a carbon side?
Yeah, I mean, they do have different values. I mean, I think I'm getting a sense of this more and more that potentially some landowners and managers are maybe being influenced by carbon pricing, and that having a bearing on what they're thinking about planting. I think our advice has always been to spread your risk, and I think if your objectives were to try and derive some timber income, is to stick to that. And I think the danger is getting drifted too heavily and being distracted by carbon funding. I mean, that range I gave of 1,500 to 3,500 per net hectare, the lower end is probably more representative of Clearfell, Sitka projects, and the higher end, £3,500 per net hectare, probably more represents the non-intervention native broadleaf projects, and probably sat somewhere in between is a mixed project which has an element of an even balance of both. But I think it's important that applicants don't get overly distracted by carbon funding and that being an overarching decision-making tool. I think clearly the rising timber price has got to be a critical consideration, as has wider co-benefits that you might want to deliver on your project.
We've got one last question before we move on to the next presentation. We've got a landowner here looking to see, well, if they plant a commercial conifer block, can they continue to thin if they sell the carbon contracts value on this project for a 55-year lifespan, for example?
Yes, I mean, at the outset of the project, when you're producing the carbon calculations which get submitted to the validation certification body for approval, you need to submit the proposed management plan. And whilst I appreciate in some cases it would be difficult to necessarily forecast whether there is going to be intention to thin or how much you might intend on thinning, we would always advise on erring on the side of caution. So if there is a possibility you're going to thin, factor that into the calculations that are being carried out at the outset. And in the event that you don't then carry out extensive thinning, there could be an opportunity to benefit from some of the enhanced capture that comes as a result of maybe alternative management strategy longer term.
Brilliant. Thanks, George. Unfortunately, we've been unable to get Matt back on the line, so we'll move now to our next presentation from Malcolm Young.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Malcolm Young, Senior Forestry Consultant at SAC Consulting. I was just going to bring a case study to you and give you some demonstration of how this works in practice, establishing woodland for investment on a farm. So we're going to look at a Gyretsmire farm, which is near Lawrencekirk in Aberdeenshire. That was a 14-hectare block of conifers, along with 6 hectares of native broadleaves spread around the farm. Now, the reasons that the farmer there was wanting to plant the woodland was partly to put the dens to better use.
Sorry, Malcolm, to come in here. You don't think you're screen sharing just now?
Oh my goodness! I've just been told that I'm not screen sharing. I'm sorry, people.
It's okay.
Right, my apologies, people. I was so enthusiastic to get started on my presentation that I actually forgot to share the screen. So sorry. So I think I already introduced myself there, Malcolm Young from SEC Consulting. So Gyretsmire farm near Lawrencekirk in Aberdeenshire is what we're looking at. It's a 14-hectare conifer block that was planted, as well as 6 hectares of native broadleaf woodland. Now, the farmer there was quite clear that these den areas were of little use to him, but they weren't really doing very much. Surrounded by arable ground and beef farming, these dens weren't doing much. Also conscious that located on a hill at about 120 meters altitude, the livestock were really pretty exposed to the winds coming off the North Sea. And it also identified an area of ground that wasn't being particularly well utilised for farming, and he wanted to see how he could better use that. So you can see here that the woodlands are spread out across the farm. On the west side, you have the steep den areas, which incorporated native broadleaves, shown by the green, a bit of yellow there, just highlighting open ground. To the south is an interesting looking H block. Now that's the high point on the hill, and that was planted exclusively for shelter, and that is about 3 years old now, and is actually beginning to provide a little bit of shelter to the sheep there. And then the main block on the east side incorporates the conifers, as well as a little bit of broadleaves. Now you'll see that there's a blue dotted line there, blue dashed line that goes through. That's a gas pipeline. So the decision was taken to plant to the south of that with native broadleaves, rather than deal with complications of getting heavy harvesting equipment crossing gas pipes in the future. The main species for planting there is Sitka spruce, both in the shelter block in the H section, as well as the main conifer block. And just slightly further north is Norway spruce, shown by the pale blue, and Scots pine by the dark green. And that's part of the grant requirements, is that you need to have secondary species. So you can see here that he's getting a considerable bit of shelter, not just with the H block, but with the main block as well. He's getting shelter along with planting a timber crop there. Now, if we go on to have a look at I should say that the main block in the east there was a fairly damp piece of ground. that had gorse growing on it. The cattle spent a little bit of time in it, but it really wasn't doing much at all for the farm. With it being quite damp ground there, the Sitka spruce was ideal for it, and that's establishing well. So looking at the figures, I've got a couple of cash flows to show you. This is the 6-year cash flow that focuses on establishment and the grants that come through. So you can see the top 2 lines. There's conifer grants with the initial planting grant shown in year 1, along with the maintenance grants shown from years 2 to 6. Ancillary items is essentially a summary term for the fencing, the gates, the guards, individual tree guards, and then crucially, the basic payment remains on the areas of ground planted. Set against that, you have the costs of the fencing and the guards. And it's deer fencing as well to keep the deer out, and rabbit netting as well to ensure the trees established properly. Ground preparation, plants, planting and maintenance. So the maintenance would be weeding and replacement of failures. You get a sort of sundries and contingencies allowance there. That's really just a bit of a buffer, safety buffer built into the figures. And then you've got professional fees, which are incurred in the design and the implementation of the scheme by a professional forester, along with annual maintenance visits. So you can see that at the end of the 6 years, net income of over £13,000 has been generated. So it's certainly an attractive earner in that respect. Now, if we look ahead, this is full rotation cash flow. So over on the left-hand side of the cash flow, you can see that I've summarized the grants and the expenditure for years 1 to 6. But we've added in some more columns here now. So year 19, we've allowed some expenditure on some roading, or at least constructing a hard standing for lorries to have a safe place to sit off the road and load their timber from. Then in years 20, 25 and 30, we have timber income from thinning, and then year 40, timber income from felling. So the timber income from thinning and felling is all estimated at today's prices. And with a typical thinning volume of round about 50 tonnes per hectare, and then at year 40, clear fell a production of round about 350 tonnes per hectare. Because it's getting clear felled, there is a legal obligation to restock. So we factor in the costs of restocking. So in year 41, we've got the figure of 24,579. That's the costs of ground preparation, supply of plants and planting. And then we've got the future maintenance costs associated with that. So we can see at the end of 44 years that the cumulative income after all the grants, after all the timber income, etc., is just over £250,000. So not a bad investment, and considering that most of the land that was planted to Sitka really wasn't doing much at all, then this has been a real win for the farm. So hope that was a useful run through for you.
Fantastic, thanks very much, Malcolm. We'll open back up to questions on the floor. We've just had one pop through here. This one's down to yourself, Malcolm. When you mentioned gorse is excluded under a BPS claim. Where gorse is removed to allow tree planting, is it then included in the BPS payment component for the woodland creations?
I would have to pass on that question. I would have to ask an agricultural consultant if that would be the case. My assumption would be that if the gorse is removed, which you can get grant for now, that the BPS would apply across the entire area.
But a second question coming through as well, Malcolm. Are the sale of timber cash flows based on current timber prices, or are they a forecast based on future values?
Based on current timber prices. So we can do some, show them as net present values at different rates. So just at the bottom of the screen, it was something I put together fairly roughly, showing the net present value at different interest rates. So that gives some indication of what discounted rates might look like.
Fantastic. We've had a few more questions coming through as well. Namely, when you are designing a scheme, what is the minimum area you can do for woodland creation? And what point does it break even?
Right. Okay. I'll just bring that back to there. For productive areas, there is a minimum eligible area of 2 hectares in a single block. So you'll see the H block in the screen, because that was attracting the conifer grant. That had to be a minimum of 2 hectares. Any lower than that, and you're not eligible for the productive grant. For it to really work for you, you're looking at round about the 10 to 12 hectare mark to break even after 6 years.
So 10 to 12 hectares to break even. Fantastic.
That's right. And that will also depend on the shape and layout of it. So if you've got, you can see that the likes of the H block has got a great deal of fencing associated with it for a relatively small area, whereas in a more regular shaped block, there's going to be less fencing, and so it'll be less expensive to establish.
We've got another question coming through as well. In terms of the design of a woodland, we've got people asking, is it worth considering access and extraction from the outset, or is this something that you can essentially plant and deal with in 30, 40 years' time?
Absolutely consider access right at the start. There's too many woods scattered about Scotland that are inaccessible and blowing over now because access was never given any consideration at the outset. The wood here is fairly easily accessible. You can see the contour lines there in brown. It's fairly gentle ground, and it's either a road can be built over to there relatively easily, or timber can be forwarded out over a fairly short distance. But it's an absolutely critical factor. If you're going to plant ground for timber, you need to know how you're going to get it out in the future, and you're going to want to make that as efficient as possible.
Brilliant. But a brief question regarding the use of sheep and trees. Is it possible to combine livestock shelter with commercial forestry?
Yes, I think forestry is forestry, woodlands, trees do deliver multiple benefits. So if you plant it for one reason, it's very unlikely that it's going to perform that one role alone. So if you plant it for timber, you will get shelter benefits from it. You will get a water reduction benefits from it. So and a plethora of other benefits as well. So yeah, I think if shelter is going to be important, then perhaps you want to think carefully about how you can balance the delivery of a timber crop and shelter with the same woodland. Or indeed, do you need to actually separate them out into different woodlands? As has been done here, there's biodiversity and making use of the dens was one objective, and got a different treatment from the part of the farm where better use could be made of agricultural ground.
Brilliant, thank you. We'll open it back up to the floor. If any of the attendees have got any questions for any of the panelists, will open to anyone who has any additional questions. We've managed to get a brief update from Matt Thompson. He passes his apologies on. Unfortunately, OpenReach have just severed the phone connection into his household and village. He's trying to reach another location with signal that he can dial in from. Unfortunately, it doesn't look like he's going to manage that in time before the end of this session. So again, apologies on behalf of Matt Thompson on that one. Unfortunately, it's one of those challenges. Do we have any further questions to the floor? Well, I think that's all questions answered so far. We'll keep an eye open to see if anything else comes in while we're closing just now. But finally, I'd like to say thank you for all the panelists for joining us tonight and for all the helpful presentations. There's a lot of information covered there and a lot of sectors of the market. And hopefully it's been useful to all the attendees. And thank you for everyone who's attended. So finally, thank you for joining us for tonight's Farm Advisory Service webinar. If you have any questions regarding buy into forestry or anything else you've heard on today's program, you can contact the Farm Advisory Service on 0300 323 0161 or email the helpline at advice.fast.scot. So thank you everyone for attending and good night.